Did you know that the Bible lays out exactly how nations fall from freedom into tyranny? I'm going to show you how it happens, and I'm also going to give you a game plan that you can implement to keep yourself free like we were designed to be. I'm Joe Brown. I run Heresy Financial, where I teach active investors to decrease portfolio risk and increase long-term returns. But before that, I was a stockbroker for years, and before that, I actually went to Bible school to go into Christian ministry. Most people are unaware how much the Bible has to say about wealth and freedom. Now, you may be familiar with the Exodus story as told in great movies like The Ten Commandments and The Prince of Egypt. But before this story of the Exodus happens in the Bible, it tells the origin story and how the Israelites actually got into slavery in Egypt in the first place. It starts with a guy named Joseph, who was a Jew, and he was able to rise to the second in command position in Egypt just under Pharaoh. Because of his position of power, he brought his family and therefore Israelites into Egypt, and they originally had preferential treatment as a result of his position in power. The way he was able to get into this position of power was partly because he was able to interpret dreams. And these dreams told the future. One of these dreams was from Pharaoh himself, and Joseph told Pharaoh that his dream meant that in Egypt, they would be getting 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And because of this, what they needed to do was prepare during those 7 years of plenty so that they could survive through the 7 years of famine. They took it very seriously, they stored up a lot of grain, and everybody was saved. But soon after that, in the biblical story, the Israelites are now slaves and they're trying to escape from Egypt. So what happened? Let's take a look more closely at what happens during this famine. In Genesis 47, verse 13, it says, "There was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house." Pretty self-explanatory so far. Egypt had stored up a bunch of grain. Everybody everywhere was buying all the grain from Egypt. Pharaoh was getting rich. Then in verse 15, it says, "When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, 'Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is gone.' And Joseph answered, saying, 'Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money's gone.'" So the famine is still going on. People have spent all their money. They've got nothing left. And they say, "We don't want to die. What can we do to get some grain?" And Joseph says, "Well, pay me with whatever you have, which, your livestock. You pay that, we'll give you some grain." Verse 17, so they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. And that year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. But when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are now yours. There's nothing left in the sight of you but our bodies and our lands. Should we just die, both us and our land? Instead, buy us and our land in exchange for food. We will with our land become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and the land may not become desolate." So they said, "We have no money, we have no livestock. Are we gonna just die here? No, we'd rather be slaves. Take our land and our lives, we'll work for you in exchange for food." So verse 20, Joseph bought all of the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not have to sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you. Work the land. And at the harvest you shall give 1/5 or 20% to Pharaoh, and 4/5 or 80% shall be your own, as seed for the field and as food for yourselves and your households and as food for your kids." They said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute or a law concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone was the only one that did not become Pharaoh's. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a little bit of a tragedy, but take a moment to step back from this and think of the scale. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream that we will have 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And he tells Pharaoh, we have to start saving up enough grain so we can make it through all these years. Do you think in a large civilization like that, that kind of planning and operation could go unnoticed? Do you think that the reasons would not have been known? When you see a massive government over a massive civilization spending 7 years building the infrastructure and storing up grain that nobody will know? Absolutely not. What happened here was that the people looked at the government taking those actions and said, we'll be fine. The government will take care of us. And so during the 7 years of plenty, individuals did not store up for themselves, did not save for themselves. They did not plan properly and save and consume less than they produced during those years of plenty. Instead, they lived high on the hog and they lived large and in charge, consuming everything that they produced, hoping and trusting that the government would have their back. Year 1 of the famine, they spent all their money. They were out. They were gone. Year 2, they lose their livestock. Year 3, they're slaves. And it's kind of funny because in the Bible it says, to this day, Pharaoh should have 20%. And it's true. To this day, the government takes from many people 20% and many people way more than that. Now, at the end of this story, everyone is a slave. When we fast forward to the beginning of the story of the Exodus, it's the Israelites who are the slaves. The problem is that once the government has that power over people, there is precedent to use that and abuse it. Then when you have a small minority group that seems like, hey, they get preferential treatment, the majority doesn't like that, you turn around and demonize that group, and it then turns into, in this story, only the Israelites were slaves, and they were slaves. And one more key note here before we dive into the blueprint is that only the land of the priests was not purchased because the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, so they were able to live on just the income that the government gave them, and so they didn't have to sell their land. And then later it says only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. In other words, in this fall from freedom to tyranny, there's always going to be a small carve out of politically connected individuals who escape the tyranny because they are the closest to the power. So what is this blueprint from freedom to tyranny? It might have dawned on you already at this point, but step 1 is that you give up your responsibility. When individuals looked around and saw the government storing up because the government was saying we got 7 years of plenty and we're gonna have 7 years of famine, individuals gave up their responsibility to care for themselves. They said, we're gonna spend everything we make, consume everything we produce. We're not gonna save for ourselves because we're gonna trust that a government has our back. In other words, they abdicated their responsibility to provide for themselves. Giving up your responsibility is always the first step in the road to tyranny. Once they gave up their responsibility, the next step was they lost their money. The next step was they lost their assets, in this case, livestock that produced for them. And the final step was they became slaves, which meant that they ended up with no rights. If you give up your responsibilities, you will eventually also be giving up your rights. And the only way to maintain your rights is to uphold your responsibility. They are essentially the exact same thing, separated only by time. Because we're talking about the Bible, I'm going to make this a little bit personal for churches. Today, there are many churches and religious people who are scared about losing tax-exempt status in the United States. They're scared of political persecution. And while I think many of these fears are misplaced, we have to take a look at the responsibilities that the church has given up over the last 100 years. The Bible is very clear of the church's purpose and the purpose of giving in generosity. It is not to buy buildings. It is not to pay the salaries of pastors, the salaries of staff, to have strobe lights, to have concerts every morning, and to have empty buildings. The purpose of the tithe and generosity is to take care of the poor, to take care of the oppressed, to take care of the widow and the orphan, those people who cannot take care of themselves. The church has abdicated this responsibility to a government that said they would do it instead, to a government that does it way worse than the churches could do it. And when you give up your responsibilities, you will eventually see that that led to you losing your rights. Which means for any individuals who are looking at this and saying, well, I don't want that to be me. Number 1, keep producing more than you consume. Save. Invest. Never get yourself into a position where you are reliant on somebody else. Your responsibility is to take care of yourself and to take care of those who rely on you. It's not a privilege to take care of you and your own. It is a responsibility. Never give that responsibility up and hope that somebody in a position of power will do it for you, because they will, and they will jump at that chance, because the people who love power use it and abuse it to take away your responsibilities, and therefore they get your rights as well. Keep a watchful eye out. If necessary, go somewhere where you're treated better before it gets to the point where it's too late and you can't. There are plenty of places on Earth that are difficult or impossible to escape from, but they were not always that way. There's always a window of opportunity to leave before it gets that bad. The only people who stay think that there's no way it can get that bad, but it can. It is always difficult to walk away from handouts, but understand that there's no such thing as a handout without a handcuff. And that while walking away from that handout might be difficult, it is ultimately better because you are also walking away from the handcuff. And that is because it is the only way to get to the promised land. If you remember in the story of the Exodus, when the Israelites finally escaped Egypt and then they were hungry in the wilderness, many of them complained, saying it would have been better if we would have stayed as slaves in Egypt because at least then we had food given to us. But the only way to get to that promised land, which is ultimate freedom, is to accept that it is paired with the ultimate responsibility. There are no handouts without handcuffs, and there are no rights without responsibilities. Pick the better path, because one leads to slavery and the other leads to the promised land. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.